Hello historians, welcome to the Unit 1.4, the Enlightenment Furthering Democracy Notes. Please go ahead and take a minute to review the objective and break down the essential pieces by circling the thinking skills your brain will have to use, boxing the content or subject that we are going to have to learn, and then underlining what you will have to do at the end of this lesson. Go ahead and pause the podcast now to break down the objective. Let's take a look at our objective and the essential pieces you should have broken down. Given marginalia notes, students will be able to, the thinking skills are define and explain. Specifically, students will be able to define the terms revolution and enlightenment, and then explain how the Enlightenment influenced Western political thought. You're going to show me that you can complete this objective by writing a 5-sentence free write paragraph at the end of today's lesson. If we don't remember what Western political thought means, Western refers to the advanced developed countries in North America and Europe, political refers to government, and thought is just thinking. So literally, we are looking at how developed countries, advanced countries, think about government. Now, in previous lessons, we've learned that these Western developed nations specifically think that democracy is a good type of government, and therefore countries like the United States, France, Great Britain, Germany, and other places have borrowed lots of Greek ideas and also lots of Roman ideas. Today we're going to shift and look at the ideas that these countries borrowed from the Enlightenment. Just to give you an image of what the Enlightenment was, the Enlightenment was basically a time period, a segment of history in which many different philosophers, many different thinkers like these individuals up here, came up with a lot of different ideas on government. These ideas were ideas which kind of changed people's way of thinking and therefore created more democratic, more fair practices where people could have the power in government. Now specifically, let's take a look at where the Enlightenment got started. I'd like you to annotate on your map that the Enlightenment starts here on the continent of Europe. If we take a look at this map, the world has 7 continents. There is North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Antarctica. These are the 7 continents, meaning the 7 large bodies of land on Earth. Continents are not countries. There are lots of countries inside a continent, but a continent is not a country. If we look at the continent of Europe and we zoom in, we'll see that the Enlightenment specifically starts in the country of France, but specifically in the capital city of Paris. Please go ahead and annotate that the Enlightenment starts here in the city of Paris, located in the country of France, which is located in the continent of Europe. Now, even though the Enlightenment starts in Paris, France, it will spread throughout the rest of the world, which is going to lead to many revolutions. A revolution is a fight against government. So this Enlightenment, this time period that starts in Paris, is going to create a lot of ideas that call people to fight against governments. Governments that the people thought were unfair. Now, these ideas in Paris, France are going to become so popular that they're going to spread to the rest of Europe, causing other people in other countries to fight their governments. And then eventually these ideas become even more popular that they're going to spread around the whole world, causing people to want to fight governments all over the world. Here we can see this idea of a revolution, the people angry with their government and therefore fighting and going to war against their government that they believe is unfair. Now, some more information on the Enlightenment, specifically This time period, known as the Enlightenment, took place between the 16 and 1700s. So it was about 100 years time period of many different governmental ideas being created. Now, a lot of times the Enlightenment is referred to as an intellectual revolution. Intellectual refers to thinking, and revolution can mean to fight your government, but revolution can also mean a change. So we got to remember that revolution can have two meanings. A revolution can mean that someone or something or a group of people are fighting, but a revolution can also mean a change. So this Enlightenment time period of 100 years, where lots and lots of new ideas were being created, these ideas basically were a change in thinking. And so it's known as an intellectual revolution. What are some of the changes in thinking that were happening? What were some of the new ideas being developed by these philosophers, by these thinkers? First of all, some of the new ideas stated that the government's only job was to protect people's rights. That is a very different idea, because before, governments believed that their only job was to just do whatever they wanted and ignore the people's rights. One of the second big changes in thinking were that people's rights could not be taken away, meaning that the government could not take away your rights. Your neighbor could not take away your rights. This is a huge change in thinking, because before, people believed that rights could be taken away. That if the government wanted to, or if your neighbor wanted to, he or she could just take your rights away and there was no law or no reason to protect those rights. A third big change was that individuals matter, meaning that humans deserve respect. Believe it or not, this idea did not always exist, and therefore people did not always feel that they were important or that they deserved respect. Now, the interesting thing about idea 3 is that this idea, which became very popular during the Enlightenment, was actually an idea that many Enlightenment philosophers, meaning many Enlightenment thinkers, actually borrowed from the ancient Greeks. They borrowed this from the ancient Greeks and they kind of expanded more on it. So just how the United States has borrowed ideas from the Greeks, the Enlightenment also borrowed ideas from the Greeks. The fourth idea that the Enlightenment created was that there should be equality for all people, and that there should be fairness for all people, that people should be treated equally and fairly, which, believe it or not, these ideas did not exist very often before the Enlightenment. The sixth idea was that society, meaning human beings, could improve with knowledge and education. That if we could learn more about the world and if we could learn more about ourselves, we could continue to come up with better and new ideas on government, to improve the government, to get rid of dictators, to spread equality, to spread fairness, to spread rights, and therefore this education would lead to a better world. Again, number 6 is not an idea that the Enlightenment necessarily invented on its own. This is actually an idea that the Enlightenment period and the Enlightenment thinkers borrowed from the Romans. So just how the United States borrowed from the Romans, the Enlightenment period and thinkers also borrowed from the Romans. Now, something that's interesting to notice is that this idea of equality and fairness, I'd like you to annotate that this idea of equality and fairness that was being spread and shared and talked about during the Enlightenment was kind of not really happening. The Enlightenment period was still very sexist, meaning they still viewed women as less than men. And so the idea that equality should be provided for all and that fairness should be provided for all really meant equality and fairness for all men. Women were not quite considered citizens yet, were not quite considered equal to men, and so the idea of fairness and equality for women was not something that all of the Enlightenment thinkers pushed. And so just how we saw some pitfalls in Greece and Rome, just how we saw that the Greeks and Romans were trying to create a democracy but were leaving out women, children, and slaves, we're also going to see that the Enlightenment has its pitfalls, isn't quite including everyone, and one of the groups not being included were women. I'd like you to circle numbers 1 through 6 because these 6 ideas created by the Enlightenment, borrowed from the Greeks and Romans by the Enlightenment, discussed and spread by the Enlightenment, these 6 ideas are some ideas that we, the United States and other Western nations, have borrowed from the Enlightenment and used today within our democracies. Remember that democracy is a type of government where the people have the power, and all 6 of these ideas support people having the power, protect people having the power, and give people the power. Now, some other interesting things to notice about the Enlightenment is that the Enlightenment, which is a time period, right? It's a 100-year time period in history, was really pushed and created by these people known as philosophers, meaning thinkers. And we can see some of these philosophers here. Some of them may seem familiar, like Benjamin Franklin, and other of these philosophers might seem new to you. For example, maybe you don't know who Kant is, maybe you don't know who Voltaire is, etc. But these are just some of these philosophers, some of these thinkers. And these thinkers were really the ones pushing new political, meaning new government ideas on what government's job was and what governments could do and what governments could not do, etc. Now, aside from coming up with political, meaning governmental ideas, the Enlightenment philosophers were also coming up with new ideas on religion. For example, they believed that people should have freedom of religion, or that people should have the freedom to not have a religion. They were also coming up with new economic ideas. Economic means money. So they were coming up with new ideas on how money should be distributed, meaning how it should be passed out, how money should affect society, how people should use money, should people with less money be treated better. They were coming up with all of these economic money ideas, and they were also coming up with new ideas on how society, how human beings should cooperate and work together and organize, basically how society should function. Okay. Now, all of these philosophers would come up with different ideas, sometimes very similar ideas, but what they liked to do was they liked to meet like at a bar. Today, it would be called a bar, but back then it was called a saloon. They'd like to meet at a bar or a restaurant or like a park or a local area, and they'd like to sit down and they'd like to share their ideas. They'd like to discuss their ideas and get into conversations, sometimes very heated conversations where they would argue which ideas were more important or which ideas should be focused on first. They basically would have these huge discussions and conversations on their democratic ideas. Now, these Enlightenment ideas spread to other areas of the world, and they spread very quickly. So if you remember, the Enlightenment starts in Paris, France, but very quickly is going to spread to parts of the world like Great Britain, which we can see is a tiny island nation here in Europe. It's also going to spread to Latin America, which is located down here in South America and also Central America. All of this together is known as Latin America. And we're also going to see these Enlightenment ideas spread over here to this area of the world that we know today as North America. Now, back then, North America was not called North America. It was just referred to as the New World because not a lot of people had been to this area of the world. And so it was considered new because we didn't know a whole lot about it. Okay. If you're not familiar with too much history, Europe tends to be called the Old World because this is kind of where most of the old civilizations were at. And this area of the world before it was North America is called the New World because not a whole lot was known about it. It was considered fairly new. Now, these ideas we're going to see were considered very controversial, meaning they were seen as very hot topic ideas that caused lots and lots and lots of fights because these new democratic ideas pretty much were challenging the medieval. They were challenging the old ways of thinking. And a lot of times when people have an old medieval way of doing things, they get pretty defensive and angry when you try to challenge them to use a new way of thinking. We're going to go ahead and pause here. Please jump into the second portion of the podcast at the link provided.